Okay, this discussion is going to focus on the administration, scoring, and interpretation of tests. So with the last chapter that we had talked about, we just kind of got into, again, kind of how we order tests and some of the different general structure of testing that we do to test physical performance. This will actually get into what tests we utilize for specific qualities, and then we'll talk about some basic statistics terms that get used as far as scoring tests. Okay, so athletic performance, what do we measure? Here, watch these videos that I have. We'll talk about all these different abilities. All right, so between the videos and the pictures here, we have different abilities getting tested for. It's important to differentiate between all of them. This picture up here, the 1 repetition max squat, we look at maximum muscular strength or low speed strength. This is related to the amount of force that a muscle or muscle group can exert, typically in a 1 repetition maximum. It could also be tested isometrically and isokinetically with certain types of equipment, but typically you will do a multi-joint primary core lift and get a 1 repetition maximum measurement from that. The video that you watched up in this region of the vertical jump, that's an example of anaerobic or maximum muscular power or high speed strength. So that's related to the ability of muscle tissue to exert high force while also contracting at a high speed. So here we have a velocity component. So power and strength, and we talked about this earlier in the semester, are not the same thing. Strength typically it really just looks at force development. Power looks at both force and velocity. So other ways that you can test this, you can test this through a cycle ergometer. You could test it with the Wingate test. Olympic lifts tend to be more speed-based as well. So typically, as opposed to maximal strength, which is an effort that takes usually around 3 seconds, you're only looking at about 1 second, typically with maximum muscular power. Down in the corner, the video you saw down here of the athlete doing the pro agility drill. Here we're looking at the ability to change direction or speed of the whole body in response to a sports-specific stimulus. So, agility testing is usually looking to assess some sort of either change of direction, speed, maneuverability, or reactive ability. Okay, and depending upon the test you choose, that will be what basically gets tested with that particular agility test. Down here, we're basically illustrating speed. Speed is just movement per distance time. So this is typically quantified as time taken to cover a fixed distance. You could look at a 10-yard acceleration, or you could look at 40 yards to look at maximal speed. So it's usually, it'd be testing with various types of sprinting tests. Okay, so those are some of the variables that we look to measure in some of the different ways, and we'll talk about specific tests later on in the chapter. Okay, so what other attributes do we look to measure? Okay, so we look to measure other attributes. So anaerobic capacity. So we talked about anaerobic power. We also look to test anaerobic capacity. That's the maximal rate of energy production by both the combined phosphagen and anaerobic glycolytic systems. Usually your time frame for that could be around 30 to 90 seconds, particularly if you're looking to get more of the anaerobic glycolytic system. Local muscular endurance is another thing we look to test. That's just the ability of certain muscle groups to perform repeated contractions against a submaximal resistance. And again, we'll show all tests for all of these different things later on. Aerobic capacity, so that's just the maximum rate at which an athlete can produce energy through oxidation of energy sources, so carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, okay? Typically that gets estimated with some field-based tests. Again, we'll have some examples of them. And aerobic capacity is usually expressed as volume of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body weight per minute, okay? That relates a little bit more also to aerobic power. whereas that's the rate in which the aerobic ability gets utilized, but we test both of those through different types of aerobic testing. Flexibility is another attribute that we tend to test, where we look at range of motion around a body joint. So we test that with things like goniometers, things like the overhead squat test. Balance and stability is another thing we do. So balance looks at the ability to maintain static and dynamic equilibrium. Stability is the ability to return to a desired position following a disturbance of the system. So it's basically like you get disturbed, you're able to get yourself back to kind of that balanced position. Okay, and then body composition, we look at relative proportions of weight by fat and lean tissue. So we kind of measure body fat. Anthropometry is another thing. It's the science of measurement applied to the human body. So we generally include with that things like height, weight, and then selected body girth. So we're going to talk about all of these different types of testing. So we have all these various attributes and qualities that we look to measure. We'll go through some specific ones, and I'll kind of mention which ones I think are good, which ones I think maybe aren't so good for certain things, which may be even a little different than what your text describes. So for testing conditions, we talked about this a little bit in the previous chapter. So to maximize the reliability of a test, conditions need to be as similar as possible for all athletes. So we want to make sure that we have good reliability. We want to make sure that we're keeping the environment in mind as well, particularly for safety purposes, but also to make sure that, if we're going to look at different testing at different times, we don't want the environment to impact the testing. So for instance, if one day they're getting tested indoors and air conditioning, and the next day they're outside and it's hot and humid, you're probably going to get different. There's a chance you could get different results. Okay, so it's very important to kind of keep that in mind. Athletes should not be tested when fatigued. They should ride normally hydrated with standard nutrition. And then warm-up should be standardized. So make sure everyone goes through a warm-up. We're going to talk about warm-ups as a part of one of the chapters coming up, and kind of how we can structure warm-ups. But again, for testing purposes, we want to make sure they're all standardized. So 1 repetition max strength, we already kind of showed an illustration of this. So coaches should aim to find a 1 rep max within 3 to 5 attempts. Sometimes there's hesitation to do this. In reality, going for a 1 repetition max is actually, in a lot of ways, safer. People hear 1 repetition max and they think it's dangerous because they're lifting a heavy weight one time. And sometimes people will opt for 3 to 5 rep maxes. And in reality, the 3 to 5 rep maxes, it actually gets a little dicier at times, because what happens is, because of fatigue and technical breakdown. So for instance, with a 1 rep max, usually if you're not going to get the weight, you're just going to fail. And as long as you have good spotters, you should be fine. 3 to 5 rep maxes, if your form and techniques breaks down and you kind of push through it, that's a lot of times where injuries could come in. So these are just some examples of things that you can get 1 repetition max strength in: the bench press, the squat or the box squat, the clean, bench, pull, deadlift. And I did put box squat on there twice. I didn't do that intentionally. That was a mistake that I'm seeing now. But so that in all these slides, if I put a little star next to something, it's something that your textbook doesn't talk about, but can be included. But these are different tests that you can utilize for that. I'm just going to show some examples. Now, this is a 1 repetition max bench pull, so this can test for the pulling muscles. I typically just test the pressing muscles, so I'm not going to show illustrations of all the tests. I'm just going to kind of show some specific ones that might be a little different, so refer to your textbook to look at some of the others. But the 1 repetition max bench pull, you could kind of see this. It's kind of a way, if you would want to quantify upper body pulling strength, utilizing the muscles in the upper quarter to do a pulling action. Classically, a lot more pressing gets done, usually just because it's easier to quantify. With this method, you can kind of quantify it a little more. You can see how she brings the barbell up to the bench when doing that. So if you did want to choose to utilize that, you would be able to. So lower body power. So remember, for lower body power, you're looking at speed of contraction. So here you have a lot of different jumping tests. The Margarita Calamine test, which is actually a very good test to do. The only thing that makes it difficult is that you have to have it is more so the testing location. And when you actually get to look at the test, you'll see why it could be a little difficult. But it is actually a very good test. And again, I give some other examples here. A box jump is another easy way you can test for lower body power. And then various types of medicine ball throws can work as well, particularly for the upper body. So here's just simply a vertical jump using a commercial, what they call a Vertec device. You can just basically measure the vertical jump through that. This is a static vertical jump using a pad. So these pads work well. The only thing is you have to make sure when they go and do this that they don't cheat. So when they jump, the pad basically times how long they're off the pad for. So the way they can cheat is if they kind of flex their hips and knees to make it seem like they're off the pad longer. So if you're using this type of measurement to test the vertical jump, you have to kind of make sure that when they go to jump, they keep their legs straight, so when they land, it's more indicative truly of the time they're off the pad. So in other words, if he jumps and flexes his hips and knees, it could seem like he's off the pad longer and then he's jumping higher when in reality he's not. So again, it's just another way to kind of measure a vertical jump. So in this test, it's what's called a reactive strength index. So it's a reactive strength index. You can see he's landing off of the box. Same idea. So you're going to get a measurement here. It's going to look at you're going to contact the mat, look at the maximum height of the jump. So you look at it's basically testing more of a reactive ability due to the fact he's kind of landing and having to immediately respond. So it's a different type of power measurement because, again, you look at some different types. There's difference between like a static vertical jump. The qualities are slightly different than when you're looking at a reactive strength index. So this is the Margarita Calamine test. This is actually a really good test for lower body power. The only kind of caveat to it is you really have to have a very specific way of measuring it, and you have to have stairs that have the right slope and measurements with the ability of a run up. Okay, so what happens here is the athlete sprints towards the stairs from about 20 feet away or 6 meters from the base of the steps, and then goes up the staircase 3 steps at a time. And then the time, you can see where the timing stops and starts. They basically get a power index utilizing a formula. And you don't have to memorize the formula, it's in your textbook, but they actually measure lower body power that way. Again, this is actually a really good test. The only reason why a lot of people don't use it is because they don't have that kind of setup. I do know of some people that actually kind of create it. They kind of built their own staircase, if you will, with these exact measurements so that they could do the run up. But if you could do it, it's a really good test to measure lower body power. It's kind of forgotten about a lot of times, but it's certainly one that could be utilized. Okay, anaerobic capacity. Now, again, I talked about at the beginning how typically you look at 30 to 90 seconds. Again, that could be even a little bit shorter, particularly if you're testing alactic capacity. So now I will say this from a practice perspective, and this will be something that I talk about a little bit more in some of the other classes. Some of these tests are overused and used inappropriately for certain sports. In particular, the 300-yard shuttle. So yes, the 300-yard shuttle is certainly an anaerobic capacity test. It tests the lactic system, but it kind of inappropriately gets applied to a lot of sports, particularly football. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to have a football player run 300 yards when they'll never do that one time in a game. So it really doesn't it's really not indicative of anything. There's a 60-yard shuttle, and there's something called the Ross test, which when we meet in class, I'll talk a little bit more about. The Ross test is actually a really good anaerobic capacity test. It's well studied for a lot of your field-based sports. So it's another test that can be utilized for anaerobic capacity that your textbook doesn't talk about. So here's the 300-yard shuttle. So the 300-yard shuttle, usually the way they set it up is with a 25-yard split. What they'll do is athletes will sprint 25 yards, then immediately sprint back, and what they'll do is 6 round trips as fast as possible. They'll usually do 2 trials of this, and then what they'll do is they'll average them out to the nearest second, and that's what you'll get for the 300-yard shuttle. They use this a lot. I remember when I played football in college, this was a test we used as I went and learned more and more about this stuff. It's really not a good test to test anaerobic ability, actually, in a lot of sports, because again, if you think about it, you're never really running 300 yards at one time, and then let alone having to repeat it. So it really doesn't necessarily test the anaerobic abilities as it relates to a lot of your field-based sports. Muscular endurance. So again, we said just the ability of a muscle to repeat against a submaximal effort. Again, you see a lot of different body weight tests here. So there's the partial curl up, push up, pull up, Ymca bench press test, and I threw the side bridge in there. Again, different tests that you can look at as far as muscular endurance is concerned. So here they're just showing how you would perform the partial curl up if you wanted to do this. I prefer testing a lot of the more stability-based abdominal movements. Like I said, I put the side plank on there. There's actually a couple other abdominal tests that test kind of static ability at the abdomen. But here, if you wanted to do this, you can see the beginning and end position. Basically, what you do with this is you set what's called a metronome. So a metronome kind of puts off beats to kind of put the person at a pace, and the individual does slow controlled curl ups with the timing of the metronome. The upper back has to touch the floor between each curl up, and you want the person to perform as many curl ups as possible without pausing to a maximum of 75. So as the metronome kind of clicks back and forth, the person moves up and down based off the metronome, just so that they don't start doing them too fast and kind of getting sloppy with it to where the repetitions wouldn't count anyway. Here's for the push-up. You can see a slightly different setup for males versus females. You see the beginning and end position. The old Army standard used to be do as many repetitions as possible within a 2-minute time period. That's actually changed. The Army has kind of changed their testing. They actually do what's called now a hand release push-up, where you lower your body to the ground, pick your hands up, put them down, and then press yourself up again. So they actually did change that. But, you know, again, if you still just wanted to test max push-ups, you certainly can. So that would be another upper body muscular endurance test. The Ymca bench press test. I haven't seen this one used a whole lot. This is another one where you use a metronome. So resistance is set at 80 pounds for males, 35 pounds for females. They set the metronome in a cadence of 60 beats per minute just to establish a rate of 30 repetitions per minute. So basically, it beats once, you go down, beats again, you go up, and you just do it based on that. So you don't want you just going and doing reps as fast as you can. You have to control your cadence. And again, the test is performed until the athlete can no longer perform any repetitions.